The dust of the road was a second skin, a gritty shroud Elara wore over the black fabric of her widowhood. Her horse, a stoic grey mare named Ghost, plodded with a rhythm that matched the weary beat of its rider's heart, a slow, tired metronome counting out the days since she'd had a reason to hurry. They entered the town not as a destination, but as a necessary stop, a place of salt and grain and hardtack before plunging back into the vast, indifferent emptiness of the plains. But the town had a rot at its center, a crowd gathered in the sun-bleached square, their laughter sharp and cruel as broken glass. In the middle of them stood a heavy iron cage on a wagon bed, and inside the cage was a man. He was large, broad through the shoulders and thick in the chest, a build the jeering townsfolk had twisted with their words, calling him too chubby to run, too fat to fight. He sat on the cage floor, his head bowed, his hands resting on his knees, still as a boulder. The sheriff, a man with a tin star and rust for a soul, leaned against the wagon, chewing on a toothpick, enjoying the spectacle. Elara pulled Ghost to a halt, the sound of the crowd grating against her own carefully tended grief. She looked past the bulk of the man, the unkempt hair, the dirt-caked clothes. She looked at his eyes. They were not vacant or wild as the sheriff claimed. They were wells of a silence so profound, so utterly exhausted, that she felt the echo of it in her own bones. It was the stillness of a world that had ended, a silence she knew intimately. And in that shared, hollow space, an impossible, reckless empathy took root. She slid from Ghost's saddle, her boots sinking into the thick dust. The crowd parted for her, their curiosity piqued by the silent woman in black. She walked directly to the sheriff, her gaze never leaving the cage. "What is his crime?" she asked, her voice low and steady, unused to public speech. The sheriff spat the toothpick out. "Vagrancy. Ferality. He's a dumb animal, Found him wandering the wastes, didn't say a word. Just stared." He smirked. "A danger is what he is. We're shipping him to the asylum mines tomorrow." Elara's eyes flickered to the man, who hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged her presence at all. He was a stone at the bottom of a deep lake. "I'll buy him," she said, the words tasting foreign and mad on her tongue. The sheriff let out a short, barking laugh. "Buy him? He ain't livestock. His property of the territory now." But his eyes had a glint, the acquisitive gleam of a predator sensing an opportunity. "What have you got to trade?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescending amusement. Elara untied the small purse from her saddle. A few coins for grain, a silver dollar she'd been saving. She poured them into her palm. The sheriff scoffed, a theatrical display of disappointment for the crowd. "That won't buy you a lame horse, let alone a man's indenture." His gaze traveled over her worn dress, her dusty horse, and then it landed on her left hand. Her fingers were bare, but a pale, indelible line circled her ring finger, the ghost of a promise. He meant her horse. But her gaze followed his, and she understood a deeper, crueler bargain was being offered. He was testing the depth of her strange compassion. Wordlessly, she reached into the small leather pouch she wore around her neck, her true vault. She pulled out a simple, thin band of gold. Her wedding ring. The last piece of John, the last tangible warmth of their life together. For a heartbeat, the world went silent, and she saw him, his smile easy and his hands calloused from work, sliding it onto her finger in a dusty little chapel. The memory was a physical blow. Then she looked back at the cage, at the profound stillness of the man within, and made a choice. She would not let another soul be buried alive. With a hand that did not tremble, she held out the ring. The sheriff's eyes widened. He took it, bit it, then pocketed it with a nod. "He's yours," he grunted, tossing a key onto the dust at her feet. The silence that fell over the crowd was thick with astonishment. Elara bent, picked up the iron key, its weight heavy with consequence, and walked to the cage. The lock was rusted and stiff, and it took all her strength to turn. The door groaned open with a sound like a tomb being unsealed. The man inside did not move. He remained a statue of resignation, as if freedom were a language he no longer understood. Elara stood back, giving him space, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Slowly, like a creature waking from a long hibernation, he lifted his head. He looked not at the open door, but at her. His gaze was deep and unblinking, not questioning, not grateful, just seeing her. It felt as if he were peering past her skin and bones, into the quiet, grieving hollow she carried inside. He rose to his feet, his large frame filling the cage, and stepped out into the harsh sunlight. He was not fat, he was solid, powerful, like an oak tree that had weathered 1,000 storms. The townsfolk took a step back, a collective gasp rippling through them. They expected a roar, a lunge, a display of the feral violence the sheriff had promised. He did nothing. He simply stood there, blinking, his eyes adjusting to a world without bars. Ilara turned without a word and walked to her horse. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She trusted the invisible tether that had formed between them, the strange pact sealed with a circle of gold. She heard his heavy, shuffling steps in the dust behind her, a steady and constant presence. They walked out of the town, leaving the whispers and stares behind them, and journeyed into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Badlands, two solitary figures against a horizon that promised nothing but distance. The first days were a lesson in silence. They moved through a landscape of cracked earth and bruised purple mesas, the sun a merciless hammer overhead. He walked while she rode, never complaining, his pace relentless and steady. He was her shadow, a large, quiet shape that was always there, just at the edge of her vision. The first night, she built a small fire, the flames a fragile shield against the immense darkness. She offered him a share of her bread and jerky, but he only stared at it, his face an unreadable mask in the flickering light. She finally placed the food on a flat rock between them and turned her back, pretending to mend a strap on her saddle. Only then did she hear the soft sound of him eating. Trust, she realized, was not a bridge to be built, but a seed that had to be planted in frozen ground, and she had no idea if it would ever find the strength to sprout. She spoke to him sometimes, simple things. "We'll make camp here, there's water ahead." He never responded with words, but he understood. A slight nod, a shift in his posture, a glance in the direction she indicated. He was observant, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, noting the flight of a hawk, the track of a coyote. He was not the dumb animal the sheriff had described, he was simply disconnected from the world of men. One evening, as she stared into the fire, lost in a memory of John's laughter, the man picked up a piece of dried mesquite wood. He pulled a sharp-edged flake of flint from a tattered pocket and began to carve. His large, seemingly clumsy hands moved with an impossible grace and precision. She watched, mesmerized, as a shape emerged from the wood. It was a bird, its head cocked, its wings half spread. One of the wings was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle. It was a perfect, heartbreaking replica of a finch they had passed earlier that day, struggling in the dust. When he was finished, he held it for a moment, then silently held it out to her. It was not a gift of gratitude. It was a statement. "This is me. This is what I see." It was the first word he had spoken. She took it, the wood still warm from his hands, and tied it with reverence to a long leather thong she wore looped around her wrist, a strip cut from John's old saddle. The broken bird now hung beside the faint white line on her finger. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. The rhythm of their journey became a silent ritual, waking at dawn, sharing a meager breakfast, traveling through the heat of the day, making camp as the sky turned to bruised violet. He began to gather things for her, a uniquely shaped stone, a raven's feather, a spray of hardy desert flowers. He never presented them with any ceremony, simply leaving them on her bedroll for her to find in the morning. She, in turn, made sure he had the best pieces of wood she could find, leaving them by his side of the fire each night. His carvings became their evening chronicle. He carved a gaunt wolf, a coiled snake, a scorpion with its tail arched to strike. He was carving the harshness of the world around them, documenting their survival. Then the sky broke. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in from the west, the clouds a dark, churning sea. Lightning spiderwebbed across the heavens, and the thunder that followed was not a rumble, but a percussive crack, like the sky itself was splitting open. They found meager shelter in the lee of a rock outcropping, the rain coming down in silvery sheets. At the first deafening clap of thunder, he folded. His large body collapsed, and he curled into a tight ball on the wet ground, his hands clamped over his ears, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking tremors. Ilara's first instinct was to reach out, to offer comfort, but a deeper intuition held her back. This was a private agony, a wound so deep that a stranger's touch would feel like salt. Instead, she turned her attention to the fire. With numb fingers, she coaxed the damp kindling to life, building the flames higher and higher, a defiant beacon against the storm's fury. All night, she sat guard, feeding the fire, its warm, dancing light a fragile fortress against the violent memories that so clearly held him captive. She understood then that the iron cage in the town square was only the most recent of his prisons. The storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and the desert smelling of rain and sage. In the pale morning light, he went to the small, temporary creek the storm had created to wash. As he pulled his tattered shirt over his head, Ilara saw his back. It was a horrifying testament, a landscape of raised white lines and puckered scars. Some were old and faded, the work of a whip or a blade. But there were others, newer, on his forearms, thin, precise cuts arranged in patterns, like a desperate kind of calligraphy. She realized with a sickening lurch that when he had no wood, he carved his stories onto his own skin. The sight stole the air from her lungs. This was not a man who was merely silent, this was a man who had been systematically broken, who had tried to record his own destruction. Later that day, as they prepared to move on, she walked into a grove of ash trees that had been nourished by the creek. She searched until she found the perfect piece of wood, smooth, pale, and free of knots. That evening, as he sat by the fire, his hands idle and his gaze lost in the flames, she wordlessly placed the piece of ash wood beside him. It was an offering. A plea. "Use this," the gesture said. "Not yourself." He looked from the wood to her face, and for the first time, his gaze held something other than pain or watchfulness. It was a flicker of profound, startled understanding. His fingers, calloused and scarred, brushed against hers as he took the wood. The brief contact was electric, a current of shared humanity in the vast silence. That night, he began to carve, and she knew this story would be different. He worked on the piece of ash wood for many days, his focus absolute. He carved on the trail, during their midday rests, and long into the night by the firelight. He was not just shaping wood, he was excavating a memory from the bedrock of his soul. Ilara watched him, giving him the space his monumental effort required. The harsh lines of the wolf and the scorpion were gone from his work. These new lines were soft, tender, and filled with an almost unbearable love. When he was finally done, he sat for a long time just holding it, his thumb stroking the smooth figures. Then, he held it out to her. It was a family. A man, broad and strong like himself, a woman with long, flowing hair, and a small child held between them, their tiny wooden hands linked. But as she looked closer, her breath caught in her throat. The figures of the woman and child were hollowed out, their forms ghostly and translucent, skillfully carved to be mere outlines of memory. The man, however, was solid, heavy, a figure of profound grief. And in his hand, so small she almost missed it, he clutched a miniature, perfectly rendered wedding ring. Ilara looked from the tragic little sculpture to the man's face. His eyes were not empty now. They were flooded with a sorrow so immense it threatened to drown them both. The story was there, told without a single word. He was not a vagrant. He was a widower. He was a father. He had lost everything and everyone, and the world had become so unbearable that he had walked into the wilderness, seeking not to live, but simply to stop. The cage had not been a punishment, it had been the only sanctuary he could find from a world that no longer held his family. His silence was not a deficiency, it was a memorial. They traveled on, but something had fundamentally shifted between them. The space was no longer filled with mystery, but with a shared, unspoken grief. She was a widow who had lost her future, he was a widower who had lost his past. They were two halves of the same sorrow, walking side by side. They reached the formidable challenge of the Serpent River, a wide, fast-moving current that cut a deep scar through the landscape. For the first time, he took the lead. With a quiet, startling competence, he began to work. He felled dead trees with a hatchet from her saddle pack, stripped the branches, and lashed the logs together with rope and tough vines he harvested from the riverbank. He moved with the focused economy of a man who knew the language of survival, a language that had nothing to do with people or towns. The cruel taunts of the crowd, too chubby to run, too slow to fight, seemed like a sick joke in the face of his raw capability. He fashioned a crude but sturdy raft, and with a long pole, he guided them across the churning, dangerous water, his strength a bulwark against the current. On the far side, soaked but safe, they made camp on a grassy bank. As the sun began to set, he retrieved another small piece of wood he had been working on in secret. He presented it to her on his open palm. It was a ring, carved from the pale ash wood, an exact, miniature replica of the ring clutched by the grieving man in his family sculpture. He did not offer it for her finger. He simply gave it to her, an object of shared meaning. It was not a proposal or a promise, but an acknowledgement. A symbol of the twin voids they both carried. A circle for a circle. With reverent fingers, she slipped the tiny wooden ring onto the leather thong around her wrist, right next to the broken-winged bird. They found it a week later. A place nestled in a small, hidden valley, so green it hurt the eyes after months in the Badlands. A small, abandoned homestead, a cabin, a barn, and a collapsed fence, stood waiting, a skeleton of a life someone else had left behind. It was broken but not defeated. It was a place that could be mended. They stopped, and for the first time in their long journey, they did not unpack for a single night, but for a lifetime. A new rhythm began, one of renewal. They worked from sunup to sundown, falling into a seamless partnership that required no words. He repaired the leaking roof of the cabin with steady, capable hands, his strength turning a ruin back into a shelter. She cleared the overgrown garden, her hands in the rich, dark earth, coaxing a promise of life from the soil. They were not just rebuilding a home, they were rebuilding a world, a tiny, two-person world founded on quiet work and mutual respect. One evening, they sat on the newly repaired porch, watching the last sliver of the sun bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of soft gold and deep, bruised lilac. The silence was comfortable now, a soft blanket instead of a chasm. Ilara turned to him, her heart full of a feeling she couldn't name. It was gratitude, an affection, and a profound, aching peace. "You can go, you know," she said, her voice a near whisper on the evening air, afraid to break the spell. The indenture was just paper. "You are free." He didn't look at the vast wilderness beyond their valley. He looked at her. For a long moment, his gaze held hers, and she saw the flicker of old pain, but it was banked now, like embers beneath a layer of ash. He slowly reached out, his calloused fingers impossibly gentle as he took her wrist. He touched the carved bird, and then the tiny wooden ring on the leather thong. He was tracing their story, the journey from brokenness to this shared peace. Then he looked from her wrist back to her eyes, and a lifetime of silence finally broke. A single word, rasping and rough from disuse, but clearer than any sermon. Home. Their life took on the simple, profound beauty of a folk song. The days were measured in rows of beans and corn, in the neat stacks of firewood he chopped, in the setting and rising of the sun over their private valley. He filled their small cabin not with silence, but with stories carved in wood. He no longer carved broken things. He carved life, a leaping deer, a soaring eagle, a pair of horses running wild and free, their manes flowing like water. He was carving the world he saw now, a world of strength and grace, a world made possible by a single act of impossible kindness. She healed in the soil, her grief for John transforming not into forgetfulness, but into a quiet, foundational strength, like the bedrock beneath their garden. They were not lovers in the way the world understood it. They were something rarer, something deeper. They were keepers of each other's solitude, guardians of each other's scars. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she was brushing out her long hair. He reached out, his hand hesitating in the air between them. She nodded, and he gently took a lock of her hair, and with the same focused reverence he gave his carvings, he began to braid it. It was a slow, deliberate act, a weaving of her past and their shared present, a silent vow not of passion, but of unwavering peace. A promise to stand watch, to be a harbor, to simply be. We are all, in some way, trapped in a cage. Sometimes it is made of iron bars, and sometimes of grief and memory. What part of your own past would you be willing to give up to set another soul free? More importantly, who might you become if someone recognized the person inside your cage and paid the price to open the door? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And for more stories that explore the quiet corners of the human heart, don't forget to like and subscribe.